So welcome to tonight's program called Bhutan Travels in the Land of the Thunder Dragon with speaker Barry Pell. Before we start, I want to let you know that I'll mute you all upon entry, but you may put any questions for our presenter in the chat box or just email them to me because we are going to close the library early tonight and I will respond back to you via email with an answer to your question. Let me just let a couple more people in here. So also I'm filming this program for Milton Access Cable, so it may be viewed at a later date. And also I want to thank the Friends of the Milton Public Library for their support of my events. Now, let me tell you about Barry Pell. He is a world traveler and photojournalist, and he has traveled widely over 5 decades, visiting and documenting landscapes and cultures in nearly 170 countries. He has also lived and traveled in China, Eastern Europe, North Africa, and South America, and currently lectures on international cultures at schools, universities, and institutions in the Boston area. I'm very pleased that he's back with us this evening, and so now please join me in a warm welcome for Barry.
Thank you, Jean. It's great to be back, and welcome to everyone who's joined on this snowy evening. A special thanks to the Friends of the Public Library for sponsoring this program. And as Jean indicated, tonight we are going to journey to the Kingdom of Bhutan, which is, I think, one of the most unique countries that I visited. Bhutan's name, first of all, in their national language, means the land of the Thunder Dragon. And this country is nestled in the soaring and rugged Himalaya mountains. It is squeezed between its giant neighbors of China to the north and India to the south. Among its many distinctive aspects, Bhutan does not have one traffic light in the entire country. Smoking is entirely illegal, inside and out, and employees, students, and most everyone else are required to wear traditional clothing. Now, probably the most unique and famous aspect that Bhutan is known for is that years ago, the nation's leaders decided that gross national product was not a good measure of their progress, and instead they identified gross national happiness as being more important. And so in this program, I will introduce you to Bhutan's very fascinating history, its culture, its religion, Buddhism, and its way of life that has only recently begun to change because the country was isolated and did not allow tourists in or anybody who was not a Bhutanese person for hundreds of years. And that's just beginning to change now. Before we start with the formal presentation, I wanted to show you a map. But first I have to do a screen share. And we'll do that right now. And then we can view the map. So the top of the map, as you see, indicates the location of Bhutan right here, squeezed between China and India. The bottom of the map is an expansion, shows Bhutan. It's sort of generally an oval shape. The capital is Thimphu here. The only international airport is Paro over here. You can sort of get a little sense of the fact of the topography being very, very mountainous. A lot of it's snow covered, especially up in the north. It does not have any relations to speak of with China. There are no ways to get into the country from China, only from India, from where there are 3 entry points along the south border. A lot of people will visit Bhutan by flying into Paro and then traveling across half the country and then returning to the airport. In this way, they see a good portion of the country, but really restricted to the western half. My wife and I, instead, we traveled through India and we entered in the eastern part of the country over here. We then went up to the main east-west highway and therefore, thereby were able to see a good deal of the country traveling all the way across from east to west. Okay, so let's go to the photos. All right. Well, by many measures looking at this country. If you consider the landscape, which is quite impressive, the culture, the people, and especially the spirituality of Bhutan, it is, I think, one of the most extraordinary and unique places that I've had the chance to visit. On one hand, it is, of course, a very quickly modernizing country, but it is also medieval, with one foot still rooted in the past. Sustainable socioeconomic development and preservation of its culture and tradition, preservation of its natural environment. All of these policies are at the heart of government objectives. And so nearly every decision made in this country is carefully weighed for the benefit of its people through a principle called gross national happiness. And as you can imagine, this gives Bhutan a much different look and feel from other nations. It is indeed a visual and spiritual feast for visitors. It draws on the inspiration of devotional traditions, which have been practiced for generations, for hundreds of years. And these traditions have actually become a part of the people's DNA. Now, Bhutan, we found, is a land of gentle and hospitable people. Ancient monasteries like this, fluttering prayer flags, which could be found everywhere, and unforgettable landscapes that give one a lasting sense of, well, peaceful tranquility. When we walked along its ancient footpaths, time seemed to stand still for a moment, and we got a glimpse into a country that had been shut off from the outside world during most of its history. Well, today, while it's guided by its Buddhist principles, Bhutan balances modernity with tradition. In the year 2000, few people had even heard of Bhutan as a country, but by 2016, it was already being recognized by travel journals, including National Geographic Traveler, which called it one of the must-see places in the world. Well, the country is nestled in the rugged Himalaya mountains of North Asia. It is tucked between Chinese Tibet and India. It has a land area slightly larger than the state of Maryland. Now, when we read that, it was only slightly larger than Maryland, we thought, well, it won't take very long to cover this country. We'll see it pretty much in like a week or so. That is, of course, until we spent hours on the roads, which look like this: narrow, switchback, up and down the valleys, over mountain passes. Suddenly, the land appeared gigantic. Almost the entire country is mountainous. There's a high range of Himalayan peaks that forms much of the country's northern and western borders, and the highest of them soars to almost 25,000 feet. Now, many of these peaks are virtually unexplored. Some aren't even named. 1/5 of the country is under perpetual snow. And the Himalayas, well, they are a rather young mountain range. They continue to buckle and rise under the influence of plate tectonics and earthquakes, some of which in recent years have been quite sizable and shake the country, causing fatalities and destruction. Mountaineering, because of their desire to maintain worship of some of the deities in the mountains, mountaineering is banned on many of the sacred peaks out of respect for these protective deities believed to reside there. Now, the country overall has a low population, just about 825,000, and it consists principally of small settlements that look like this, tiny villages that are scattered throughout the mountains and valleys. Typically, there would be a single main street filled with very typical architecture that you see here, general stores, some small shops, and the occasional religious building. Now, at all of these places where we would stop and take a break from the roads, we were welcomed into local cafes for a cup of hot milk tea, or more popularly, butter tea, which tastes a little like a savory soup and was prepared on a wood stove like this. Well, there are about a dozen larger towns. Most of them, though, also have fewer than 10,000 residents. In contrast, the capital and largest city, shown here, is Thimphu, has over 100,000 people, quite a departure from the rest of the country. We saw this as one of the last places we visited, and after traveling through such an uncrowded country, Thimphu felt like a very big place. Indeed, many Bhutanese have been migrating into the capital for employment, and that has created, heaven forbid, housing shortages and even traffic jams in this place. Well, this is one of the city's rotaries, designed in a distinctively Bhutanese architectural style. Well, as I mentioned, there are no traffic signals in the entire country. Instead, it is local police who are employed to perform some eye-catching choreography with hand movements to direct traffic at busy intersections. Now, located on a hillside overlooking the city is a 169-foot tall seated Buddha statue. It's one of the world's largest, and it's believed to bestow blessings, peace, and happiness over the entire world. The body itself, the interior, is filled with 125,000 smaller statues of Buddha. Well, the capital, Thimphu, also contains the largest produce market, 2 levels of fruits and vegetables, and in particular, the red and eye-watering hot chilies, which are used to prepare the Bhutanese national dish, which is cheese and chili, shown here at the bottom center. Well, the Bhutanese eat chilies in every meal, even breakfast, and almost all Bhutanese dishes contain chilies in one form or another. We were told that the Bhutanese appetite decreases dramatically when a meal does not have a sufficiently spicy kick. Now, agriculture is the country's primary occupation, and of course, it's a very hilly country, so having enough arable land is a challenge. And so the Bhutanese have constructed terraced fields, some very beautiful looking like this, to grow rice and potatoes and vegetables, nearly all grown organically. Still, the lack of sufficient arable land for farming means that much produce is still imported predominantly from India to the south. Well, also imported from India is meat. Now, the government prohibits hunting and killing of animals for consumption, but there are many non-vegetarian Bhutanese, even many monks, who eat pork, beef, and chicken. You can actually get arrested and fined if you slaughter an animal for food within the confines of the country, or if you fish from the rivers, except catch and release, or even if you accidentally kill a stray dog, of which there are hundreds roaming the villages and towns, and who are kindly fed and looked after by locals. This is in keeping with Buddhist values. Of course, these animals are confident that no one will ever bother them. Now, while eating meat may seem to us as hypocritical to Buddhist ideals, the Bhutanese believe that it is okay, catch this distinction, if the animal was not killed on their behalf. So if an animal is killed outside the country and imported, shows up in a market like this, and then is bought by a Bhutanese to eat, it is okay. Well, cows, protected animals, of course, are encountered grazing and walking along roads throughout the country. But at the higher elevations, that is above 10,000 feet, of which there is a lot of Bhutan, yaks are the animals that predominate. They are herded by the country's nomadic people, and they're especially prized for their butterfat-rich milk, which is used to make butter and cheese. But other parts of the animal are used as well. Yak hair used for garments and tents, and above tree line, where firewood is not available, the yak dung is used for fuel. Well, although yaks are massive and clumsy looking, they can move very quickly, we were cautioned. They have impressively sharp horns, and we gave them a wide berth. Now, foreign tourism did not begin in Bhutan until 1974, not that long ago. It was done to raise revenue and to promote Bhutanese culture and traditions to the outside world. Now, to protect the environment, though, and to prevent an onslaught of foreign cultural intrusion, tourism is highly regulated. It requires a prepaid organized itinerary through a registered Bhutanese tour company. And to deter low-cost backpacker tourism, which they certainly did not want, there is a minimum expenditure requirement of $200 to $300 per person per day. Now, although this cost seems a bit steep, it contains essentially everything. The 3-star accommodations in traditionally constructed and decorated hotels. This is one of those hotels, and this is the very attractive interior stairway. Included all of our food, transport, our guide and driver, entry fees, permits, and visa. And we had a tailored all-inclusive itinerary, which also included a vehicle pickup in India and then an exit flight to Delhi. Speaking of flights, the country does have only one international airport, and this airport, it just has, frankly, one runway. And the runway, because it is such a mountainous country, is wedged between two mountain peaks on either end, and it is just long enough to allow jets to land and take off. So it is one of the more challenging places and a little bit hair-raising to fly into and out of the country. There are no trains in Bhutan. All journeys on the land are undertaken by road. And there are 3 land border crossing points between India and Bhutan, but crossing from China is prohibited. Now, certainly crowded and frenetic India was a sharp contrast to our smooth and peaceful entry into Bhutan. And when we arrived, we were met by our guide, Sonam, who is shown here in the sunglasses, and driver Dasho. They were both elegantly attired in long regulation robes. The men's robes are called gos, G-H-O, which are belted tightly around the waist and have starched white cuffs, knee-high black socks, and leather dress shoes. There is a traditional footwear as well, which consists of knee-high embroidered boots, some which are quite elaborately designed, generally now only worn at festivals. They look like this. Women also have a national dress. It is called a kira, K-I-R-A. It is a floor-length rectangular cloth wrapped around the body. It's made from cotton or silk for more important festivals. And some of them are very elaborate brocade dresses like these, hand-spun and hand-woven, of course, embroidered in various colors and designs in raw silk. They are famous for their intricate designs and patterns, and these textiles often take these women up to a year to complete. So Bhutan's national dress, then, is one of the more distinctive and visible aspects of the country. And wearing a national attire like this is compulsory for many segments of society. It's compulsory for public employees. It's also compulsory for school children. Many Bhutanese, though, we found, even when they weren't required to wear this national dress, were quite proud of it and wore their gos and kiras whenever they left the house. The clothing is made in a variety of traditional and elegant patterns, often on homemade hand looms, such as shown here. And the finished material for the men's gos and the women's kiras is displayed here for sale in a shop in the capital. Now, Bhutanese people, when visiting religious and government offices, are also required to wear this traditional outfit, as shown in this gathering. The country also has a formal system of etiquette, which was established centuries ago, that specifies how to dress when one visits a monastery, the polite way to greet one's boss and officials, also behaviors such as how to sit, eat, and other functions. For example, when visiting a monastery, both women and men are required to wear a sash over their shoulder, put on correctly and worn in just the right way. And this sash identifies a person's rank by the color. So, for example, the sash of ordinary citizens is made of unbleached white silk, like these men are wearing. For government officials, each level is identified by a different color. As you rise in rank, you go from green to red to blue to orange. So you can immediately identify somebody's place in the bureaucratic chain. Finally, reaching yellow. And yellow is exclusively restricted to be worn by the king of Bhutan, who is this gentleman. Now, the etiquette system is an important concept in Bhutanese Buddhist society because it's linked to their belief in respect towards one's parents, elders, and other members of the community. It emphasizes the aesthetics of performing everyday tasks gracefully and with care and consideration for others. So our east to west journey across Bhutan was just short of 2 weeks with our English speaking guide, Sonam. And he had a very important job. He educated us in the intricacies of Buddhism, about temple architecture, the country's economy, the unique national sports that I'll talk about of archery and darts, and Bhutan's policy to achieve gross national happiness. Of course, at times, being we were older travelers, he was also invaluable in assisting us along some challenging paths. But meanwhile, somewhat less English-speaking driver Dasho had perhaps the more challenging responsibility because he had to maneuver us safely on paved and unpaved, sometimes bone-jarring two-lane roads, many still under construction in this young country. Getting anywhere in Bhutan is either up or down. In fact, the only straight road in the entire country runs less than a half mile, and it's mentioned in guidebooks because it's so distinctive. With eyes focused on the twisting roads, and as Dasho watched out for cows, yaks, and the colorfully painted cargo trucks from India recklessly barreling around hairpin bends in the opposite direction, our driver somehow was able to grind to a halt and point out, say, a family of gray lango monkeys swinging through the forest on the roadside. Well, by the way, with the exception of the royal family, there are no family names used in the country. Instead, 2 names are given to children by Buddhist monks a few days after birth. And these are traditional names. They're of Tibetan origin. They're chosen because of, say, auspicious influence or religious meaning. So, for example, our guide's name, which is Sonam, means gifted or fortunate one. And it's usually impossible to tell the gender of a Bhutanese person just based on their name, since names are used interchangeably with either sex. Now, Jungha is Bhutan's official language, and it uses the same script as neighboring Tibet, shown here at the top of this slide, but it is sufficiently different that Tibetans can't understand it. English is the medium of instruction in school, so most educated people can speak English fluently. And indeed, there are English signs, books, and menus throughout the country. Road signs are all written in both English and Jungha. And in Jungha, the country is not called Bhutan, it is called Druk Yul, which means the land of the thunder dragon. It's so named because of the violent and large thunderstorms that whip down the Himalayas through the country's valleys. So the sparkling of thunderbolts was believed to be the fire of a dragon. And as a result, Bhutan has a national flag that portrays a fierce dragon at its center, one of the more unique flags I've ever encountered. Now, Bhutan is a landlocked country, of course. For centuries, it was a secluded land. It was very poor, had subsistence agriculture, there was very limited education and medical facilities, there was a very low life expectancy. It certainly was not a Shangri-La. The early history of the country is steeped in mythology. It remains rather obscure. Buddhism originated in the north central part of India in the 5th century BC. It was brought to Bhutan from Tibet about the 8th century. Now, the name Bhutan derives from a Tibetan place name meaning the end of Tibet. And this is a reference to the country's position at the southern extremity of the Tibetan plateau. Well, since the adoption of Buddhism, the country's political history has been nearly inseparable from its religious history and the relations among the various monastic schools and monasteries. Early on, there was tremendous competition and warfare for centuries between rival religious schools who were fighting for dominance. Finally, in the 1600s, a Buddhist priest known as a Lama, who was considered the founder of Bhutan, was able to consolidate the country. Now, Bhutan has the distinction, our guide proudly reminded us, of being independent throughout its history without any colonizers. A kingdom was established in the early 1900s, and it is the fifth king in the hereditary line that has ruled since 2006. Now, Bhutan is today a constitutional monarchy, that is, it has a parliament and public elections, but the king remains as the nation's guiding leader. And so pretty much everywhere in the country, you can find pictures of the king and his family prominent in homes, shops, hotels, and public spaces, as shown here in the top right side of this photo. But it certainly seemed to me that this was done more out of respect and admiration, even love for the royal family and the country's accomplishments than fear or obligation or cult of personality. The present king was born in 1980. He was educated at Phillips Academy in Andover and at the University of Oxford in England. Well, indeed, the country's achievements in roads and medicine, education, national airlines, internet, and media, to name a few, have been incredible. With 4 major rivers coursing through the country and snowmelt from the mountains, fresh water is never a problem. The country has invested heavily in developing hydroelectric power as a renewable resource. Life expectancy has nearly doubled to 71 years of age. Underlying this progress has been the philosophy of gross national happiness, which was formalized in the country's constitution in 2008. Now, in the West, of course, our concept of happiness usually focuses on the individual, but Bhutan's centers on the collective for people and society. It emphasizes harmony with nature and traditional values. The measures of gross national happiness include such factors as good government, preservation and promotion of culture, protection of the environment, and sustainable and equitable development for everyone. There is a Gross National Happiness Commission to measure progress towards these goals. Now, the Constitution mandates that there shall be a minimum of 60% of the country's land area forever preserved as undeveloped forest. Actually, Bhutan has exceeded that. The current amount is over 70%, which enables its trees to absorb 3 to 4 times more carbon emissions than its people produce. Bhutan is one of just a couple of carbon negative nations in the world. Now, this, of course, is not a program about Buddhism, but the religion and spirituality of the Bhutanese people is such an intrinsic part of their beliefs and actions and objects in architecture that I think it is important to describe a few aspects of the unique school of Buddhism that is practiced in their country. Well, the lives of Bhutanese people, whether in the treatment of others or respect for the environment, or even the care with which they weave their clothing, these values are closely intertwined with their Buddhist religion, and it is a form known as Vajrayana Buddhism. This sect is heavily focused on the worship of deities, the accumulation of merit over your life in behavior and actions, and the concept of karma from past lives. Now, Buddhism is the country's official religion. It is taught in schools, and Buddhist families will typically set aside an altar room in their home for daily prayer. Sons and less so daughters will enter a monastery to study, to become monks or nuns for for a period of months or perhaps to devote their entire lives. With shaven heads and loose-fitting crimson robes for the female and male monks, they are nearly indistinguishable from each other. Well, as Buddhism spread around the world, many different sects or schools evolved, in part adapting to local conditions and absorbing local beliefs. And permeating the Bhutanese school of Buddhism are teachings of religious beliefs and practices focused on compassion. Well, the collection of these teachings are known as Tantra, and a deep understanding of them is cultivated over a lifetime through reflection and meditation. The Bhutanese, like other Buddhists, believe that life is a countless series of rebirths until enlightenment is achieved. And the quality of each of those rebirths is based upon your actions. So it's important during one's lifetime to act in ways that are worthy and accumulate merit. Well, as I mentioned, the religious and secular are closely allied in Bhutan. Monasteries called dzongs that look like this are physically divided. One half is a government-supported religious authority, and one half is an administrative government side. Typically, Bhutanese families would send one son to join a monastery for a lifetime, and this was viewed as a way to create merit for the family and household. It was a blessing for the child. Well, in more recent times, parents who can't afford to feed their families or to pay for the uniforms and textbooks required by government schools may send a child to become a monk. Now, officially, the monasteries take children of 7 years and older, but in reality, we observe some taking children as young as 5 when they had nowhere else to go. The monastery will provide them education, largely in knowledge and understanding of a range of Buddhist texts, teachings, and rituals. They also provide accommodation, food, and clothing. There are today over 12,000 monks and nuns in monasteries and monastic schools throughout the country. Now, one thing we quickly learned traveling in Bhutan was that everything, because of its Buddhism, is symbolic and purposeful. It might represent a historic event, a religious legend, a ritual, or a means to enlightenment. There are many ritual objects used to bring Buddhism to the people. They're an important part of daily religious practice used in ceremonies and as decoration. They might include prayer bells representing a call to serenity or a start to prayers, drums, conch shells like these indicating Buddhism's omnipresence. There are long telescoping horns played during and after prayer services. And temples are decorated with colorful hanging paintings called thangkas, shown here, made on cotton or silk, which might depict a Buddhist deity, a scene, or a universal mandala symbol. Now, within the temples, there is a main assembly hall, some of which are enormous, and they would contain, first of all, an altar with statues of historical figures or protective deities, as well as an abundance of sacred objects strewn about, including rocks and holy water. There might be a pair of dice used to divine the future, even a ritual ornamental cake. The altars would be strewn with money and gifts given by devotees who come to pray and receive blessings by resident monks. Elsewhere in the hall, there would be stored libraries of traditional texts and prayer books, usually wrapped in cloth, and the entryways are covered with murals. I also might mention that in contrast to neighboring Tibet, Bhutan prohibits photography of objects and ceremonies within its temples, and their reasoning is that photographers often discard or delete digital photos, and this action is considered disrespectful to these sacred Buddhist objects. So only occasionally did I receive permission from the attendant to take a single photo inside the temple of wall decorations or prayer books. So many of my photos of Buddhist thangka wall hangings, for example, were taken in shops which offered these objects for sale. Another important part of Buddhist ceremony is the use of butter lamps, which in the past burned yak butter, but now burn less flammable and, I must say, less pungent vegetable oil. They're used as ritual items in most Bhutanese temples and also in the household altars that private individuals set up. The offering of light in golden cups represents the illumination of wisdom. And in old age, many Bhutanese citizens choose to retire to a temple where they offer voluntary services. Lighting 1,000 butter lamps on auspicious occasions is one of those services. Spinning prayer wheels are also an ubiquitous sight in the country. The revolving cylinders are filled with printed prayers and engraved in tin or some of the older ones on wood. They range from about, well, a foot tall, but they could also be as big as 8 or 10 feet in height, with massive diameters requiring a strong pull to turn them. Rows of prayer wheels are typically inset along all outside walls of a temple, as shown here, often in elegantly carved and painted wood enclosures. And some are actually driven by streams of diverted water in elegant sacred stone enclosures. Now, the process here in devotion to these prayer wheels is for the adherents to walk and spin the wheels, always in a clockwise direction, handling each one in turn while reciting prayers or mantras. And we observe that some of the groups of prayer wheels also served a role as a kind of senior center where the elderly would come each day to socialize. Our guide took us to many of these at temples and always took time to walk around and spin the sets of wheels we encountered. Of course, we followed suit, not wanting to miss an opportunity to gain merit or simply good luck for our onward travels. Now, a characteristic sight in Buddhist countries, which we also frequently observe traveling in Bhutan, are the many, many locations of prayer flags fluttering on mountain passes and rooftops and monastery and temple courtyards. Prayer flags come in 5 colors: blue, green, red, yellow, and white, which represent respectively the elements of water, wood, fire, earth, and iron. Now, the prayer for the flags is carved into wooden blocks and then printed on the cloth in repeating patterns. We also passed strings of white flags in batches of 108, which is an auspicious Buddhist number. They are erected on behalf of a deceased person, often someone who might have died in a road accident. Adding an aspect of pageantry and ceremony to the landscape, the prayer flags, whether colored or white, are placed at strategic high points overlooking a valley from which a river can be seen. And in this way, the belief is that the prayers will waft with the wind to the river and then be carried by the river on its long and winding journey. Now, one of the more curious practices of Bhutanese Buddhism is the age-old tradition of worshiping the most intriguing of objects, and that is the phallus. Now, while this custom may at first blush seem contrary to religious spirituality and irreverent, and even perhaps outrageous, at least in terms of its souvenir marketing, the town of Punakha, about center in the country, where it is in vogue, is very serious about the relevance of penis worship as a means to enhance fertility. The penis fascination has a strong historic and spiritual significance in Bhutan. It dates back to the 15th century, when an eccentric and maverick Tibetan Lama, nicknamed the Divine Madman, traveled around the country and engaged in obscene actions and sexual antics. He had the deliberate intention of provoking people to discard orthodox norms and to question the establishment. Well, in modern times, the temple he built, shown here at the top of Punakha village, has become a shrine where many newly married and childless couples from all over the world hike to seek blessings from an ancient wooden phallus totem. There's even a picture book inside the temple with snapshots sent in by visitors with their newborn infants, people who visited the temple and then, well, 9 months later, gave birth. While this Buddhist teacher wasn't widely accepted during his time, today he is one of Bhutan's favorite saints. He's worshipped for his bold ways, and the locals continue to paint the phallus outside their homes to ward off evil spirits and to invoke the fertility gods. So our time in Bhutan was filled every day with visits to stunningly picturesque monasteries like this, museums, Buddhist temples perched on mountainsides, religious monuments called chortens, fruit and vegetable markets, textile weavers, archery and darts competitions, and costumed folklore, music, and dance performances, while we traveled through breathtaking snow-capped mountain and terraced agricultural field valley scenery. Now, we visited during the spring month of April, when the valleys came alive with flowers, particularly the deep red and pink rhododendron. What made our trip particularly memorable, though, was the gracious friendliness and care we received from both our guide and driver, who were attentive to our every need and request. Now, Bhutanese architecture, both the religious and the secular, is arguably the most striking feature of the country. There are different kinds of religious buildings, these massive dzongs, monasteries which look like forts because, in fact, when they were built, they served as forts against competing monasteries. There are also remote hilltop gombas, smaller monasteries where monks can seclude themselves for peace and solitude. There are lakangs, which are yet smaller urban temples, as well as secular traditional homes. And all of them are constructed in a very distinctive Bhutanese style and decoration. The dzongs and smaller monasteries include rows of dormitory residences like these for the monks, and in larger monasteries, the number of resident monks may exceed 200. Now, up to the 20th century, these large monasteries, of which there is one for each of Bhutan's 20 districts, also, as I mentioned, were fortresses, because they were there to protect during feuds and battles with neighboring districts. And so they were built with thick walls of stone or rounded mud. They had narrow entryways to thwart attackers. Many of them, like this one, had cantilevered bridges that could be pulled up in case of attack. Today, their two wings are divided by the two functions, one, the religious temple, and the other for government offices. Now, the dzongs are built with a considerable amount of timber, including massive beams and wooden shingle roofs. This, combined with the use of all those butter lamps in the temples, has caused major fires over the centuries in almost all of them. In terms of secular housing, houses are also, like this one, quite large, also required to be constructed by the government in traditional designs. There are regulations pertaining to the color that can be used, the window shape, the decorative features, and even the roof slope. And the materials, of course, will depend on what's available in the region. Perhaps it might be bamboo or stone or wood. In the higher elevations, of course, we noted that firewood is stacked high and wide in preparation for the coming winter. Now, a distinctive structure found throughout the country is called a chorten, this pyramidal structure. We encounter them, they're known as stupas in India. We encounter them at crossroads, near or within religious sites, where they are often placed in rows, very picturesquely, even on high mountain passes. They range from about 6 feet to over 35 feet in height. Serene and peaceful, chortens are religious monuments for worship or offering. And whenever you approach one driving, you always drive around it in a clockwise direction. They were originally built to house relics of the Buddha. They now may contain sacred texts, relics, and sometimes even mummified bodies. Like all Bhutanese architecture, chortens are built in a precise, meaningful way, including a square base that symbolizes the earth, a dome that represents water, a pinnacle that symbolizes enlightenment. There's also a tall national chorten, white with a golden spire, shown here, which is a memorial to Bhutan's third king. It is located in the capital, Thimphu. It's visited as a pilgrimage every day by worshipers who walk around it clockwise 3 times while simultaneously spinning their handheld miniature prayer wheels. Some of the devotees also perform prostrations with additional prayers facing the structure when they are finished. Now, there are dozens of Buddhist religious festivals throughout the year. These are called seichus. They occur in towns and villages. With 3 or 4 festivals every month, visitors have a good chance of attending one no matter what time of year they go. The 3-day celebration we attended began with an elaborate procession of villagers, religious leaders, and musicians accompanying the regional lama to the local temple. Residents, meanwhile, stationed themselves along the road and prayed to a sacred statue being carried to the monastery. Once inside the monastery courtyard, there was a masked dancer performing an elaborate ceremony. Monks and visitors alike were then invited into the center of the temple, inside the sanctuary, for a traditional service. And afterwards, everyone went out to the courtyard where dancers whirled and leapt around, reenacting spiritual events from the past. The dancers are accompanied by a group of musicians playing traditional instruments. These festivals are a big draw, not just for tourists, but well attended by locals as well. Now, the national sport of Bhutan is archery, but I must tell you, it is nothing like we are familiar with in the West. Archery contests are not only a sport and popular entertainment, but as you can imagine, serve as an affirmation of Bhutanese cultural identity. When we arrived at the archery grounds, we couldn't even see the target, which is only about a foot wide and amazingly located some 475 feet distant. We could hardly make out the arrows as they streaked through the air. Players would stand dangerously close to the target and call out how good or bad their opponent is. Taunting and harassing one's opponents is part of the fun. The sport is played in teams. The scoring is complex. Particularly entertaining, though, if a contestant manages to hit the target. His teammates, dressed, of course, in traditional Bhutanese robed and white-cuffed outfits, gather to perform a slow, choreographed dance to sing his praises. But with similar scoring rules and charming rituals, the game of darts is also very popular in the country. Our guide found it hilarious that in Western countries, people play darts in bars at a distance of less than 6 feet to the target. Well, Bhutanese hurl homemade wood darts that look like this, with a sharp metal point that weigh up to 2/3 of a pound each. And they hurl them not 6 feet, but 66 feet at a target that has a width of less than 6 inches. I would not have believed this if I didn't personally witness the competition. Teammates stand dangerously close to the target, quickly jumping out of the way of the many errant darts. But successful hits are once again celebrated with dancing, shouting, and arm waving. Finally, while Bhutan's architecture and villages and festivals are the country's main attractions, many visitors also include a trek into the more untouched Himalayan wilderness. While treks require additional time and cost, we did not do this. But nearly all tourists will climb to a monastery called Takshan Gomba, translated as Tiger's Nest Monastery, shown here. It's said, by the way, that Guru Rinpoche, Bhutan's most important religious figure, who brought Buddhism to Bhutan in the 8th century, flew to the site of the monastery on the back of a tigress to subdue the local demon. And this religious figure is honored with a statue in every temple in the country, as well as this likeness behind protective glass painted on the side of a nearby mountain. Well, Tiger's Nest Monastery is arguably the most photogenic site in Bhutan. It appears to cling to the side of a sheer vertical cliff. Now, as you can guess, Bhutanese Buddhism is filled with fascinating religious mythology. Legend here has it that the building is anchored to the cliff by the hairs of a celestial being. Well, the route to the monastery climbs some 1,700 feet over sometimes steep, rocky terrain and up and down uneven stone staircases. There is a tea house at the halfway point to refresh. The path is moderately difficult, but of course made more challenging by the elevation, since the monastery is located at over 10,000 feet elevation. Now, most visitors therefore leave the climb to their last day, as we did, giving our lungs time to acclimate to the thinner air. We were rewarded, though, after our climb with a relaxing soak in a traditional wooden tub, the water heated by large stones taken from a fire pit. Dinner at the adjoining farmhouse was served by the family in the typical manner of rural Bhutan, that is, seated on the floor. Well, it was apparent to us that the Bhutanese have strong family bonds and adhere to cultural and religious traditions. Visiting from the more turbulent West, it was immensely appealing for us to immerse ourselves in a peaceful and safe country where homelessness and street beggars do not exist. Plastic bags are entirely banned, crime is minimal, capital punishment is prohibited, smoking and tobacco products are completely illegal. Locals seem genuinely pleased to make a good impression. Social interactions are conducted with kindness and grace, and there is care and respect for the environment. Well, indeed, there is respect for all living things, as we observed our guide carefully stopping, getting out of his car to move an insect out of the roadway so he wouldn't run it over. Due in part to the country's Buddhist ideals, perhaps to the country's low population, Bhutan has achieved something unique in its humanity and humility. Now, while Bhutan welcomes foreigners to live and work in their country, they cannot become citizens. Marriage between foreigners and Bhutanese, although not illegal, is highly discouraged. Now, from our liberal Westerners' viewpoint, it's easy to judge this exclusionary nationalist policy as extreme. But the country's regulations are intended not to discriminate, but to preserve their society's very special culture and its beliefs, rituals, and way of life. Yet, with the benefits of modernization, with increased tourism exposing its people to foreign ways and values, change is steadily and inevitably occurring. Television and internet were banned in Bhutan until 1999. Bhutan was the last country in the world to get TV reception. Foreign visitors, perhaps more telling, have increased. In 1974, there were a mere 300 foreigners who visited Bhutan. In 2017, there were 250,000. Many Bhutanese have abandoned their villages for the greater excitement and employment opportunities in the capital, Thimphu. For some, at least outside of rural Bhutan, happiness is increasingly being defined by consumerism. But for now, although Bhutan's people will continue to practice, debate, and legislate happiness, I think the fundamental Bhutanese way of life seems secure. Thank you very much.
That was incredible. Barry, thank you so much. That was a
You're
wonderful
welcome.
program. Really fascinating program.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was really great.
I tried to speed it up a little bit just to give a few people a chance to say a couple of things if they wanted to before the magic hour of 8 o'clock.
Oh, yes. So you know what? There are some messages in the chat. Let me just
good.
tell you what they are.
Yeah, I can see them too.
You can see them good. Okay, so if we go back to the first one,
It's yours. Okay.
just that from Karen. This
Thank
is
you.
fantastic. Thanks so much for sharing. And Pat, this was quite a trip. Did you plan this trip yourself? Go with the tour group? How were the Bhutanese towards those from the West? Very interesting, lovely photos. Thank you.
Yeah. So I planned this trip. As I mentioned, you have to go with an agency. You cannot go on your own. And I used the agency, which I was very pleased with, called Audley Travel, AUDLEY, which is located on Washington Street in downtown Boston. They were very accommodating, and they also all the arrangements were very smooth. And the company they worked with, through whom we secured our guide and driver, were excellent. So I highly recommend them. They're called Audley Travel. The Bhutanese couldn't be friendlier toward visiting Westerners. I mean, so far, even with 250,000 visitors, Westerners are still a bit of a novelty. They were incredibly cordial and helpful and welcoming to us everywhere we went.
It seems like a lovely country, lovely people. Thank you. So Sarah says, is there a time of year ill-advised to visit due to the climate weather? Do summers and winters offer extreme temperatures?
Yeah, there are some extremes in temperature right now. Of course, it's the middle of winter. I would not advise going there. Spring and fall are the best seasons to go. We were there in the spring when a lot of the wildflowers were in evidence, and the month of April or May would be a fine time to go there.
Okay, does anyone want to unmute themselves and ask another question of Barry while we have him here? Everyone's very quiet, Barry.
I know, either I answered all their questions or they're just overwhelmed.
Well, it was a lot of information. Beautiful.
There was a lot of
photographs.
information, and I did speed it up. My one eye was always on the clock.
On
so
the clock, yeah.
so I kind of sped it up a little bit.
Well, if anyone, let's see here. Okay, so this is from you to everyone, and if anyone, this is a message from you, right, Barry? Oh, this is me. No, I'm sorry.
That's your
Okay.
message.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
my message. So let me just say, if anyone thinks of anything they'd like to know further, please email me and I'll ask Barry and send you the message back. And
Absolutely.
I just want to thank you all for being here. Thank you very much. And spring is coming, so let's just think about that. And
Thank you.
and again, Barry, thank you very much for this
Thank you.
wonderful
And Jean,
presentation. Yeah.
Thank you. Have a safe trip home.
Okay, will do.
Yeah.
Don't worry, I have 4-wheel drive. So,
Okay, good.
okay, I'm gonna
All right.
say
Thank
good
you.
night and I'll see y'all next time.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you all.
Thanks.